Just let me know. We should get a few more. We have around 45 or so.
All right. You talk real quick. Can you talk real quick while I try to figure out this stuff?
Hello, everybody. We're going to begin in a moment. We're still waiting on one or two people, but welcome. Thanks for joining us. This will be the last session of our speaker series, Policing Black Power from Watts to Detroit, and then tonight to Flint as well. And this is the first of what will be a two-part speaker series this year in conjunction with University of Michigan's Semester in Detroit program. The next will probably be a longer speaker series and will take place during the spring semester. So we'll make sure to get all information about the series available and up to everybody as quickly as we can. I'm here tonight at the General Baker Institute, broadcasting live with Carolyn across the table from me. She's working on the technical aspects of it. And we're just trying to get everything running right before we begin. I'm not going to play any music this week because last time I did, we got shut down. It was like a Questlove experience, where you'd have to stop the music every 20 seconds so you didn't violate some copyright laws. So no music tonight, but we'll begin very shortly.
Duly noted. And good evening. How you doing, Dr. Gobert?
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Carolyn Baker. I'm with the General Baker Institute. Like you said, this is our last, I like to call it, episode of our 4-episode series, Policing Black Power from Watts to Detroit and now to Flint. So welcome, everyone. I'm with the General Baker Institute. We are built off of 4 pillars. Our pillars are internationalism, projects of survival, arts and culture, and political and popular education. If you are not a subscriber to our YouTube page, I'm going to ask you to please, 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 at some point, go on our YouTube page, hit the subscribe button. It's the little bell, hit the bell, and become a subscriber so you will get notifications in the future. Thank you for joining. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you to U of M students. Thank you to Wayne State students. And thank you to both administrations.
All right, let me begin. Notice how she didn't say thank you to me. I take that very personal, but that's good. That's good. She was beating me at chess before we started, so it's all love. I want to thank you all for being here today. And I do want to say some thank yous before we complete this last episode, as Carolyn said, particularly Craig Register from University of Michigan, a Semester in Detroit program, Marion, who did the flyers for the event, Val, who's to my right, and Carolyn across the table from me, and all of our panelists that we've had. We've had some wonderful panelists across these 4 sessions. So I just wanted to, if anybody is on here from those previous sessions, I wanted to thank them. And I wanted to thank our guest tonight for agreeing to be here with us. So let me give you a brief recap of what we've done and kind of explain why we're ending where we are. In my class, I was emphasizing policing and public health and racism, right? To kind of be timely with what's going on in the world around us. And so we were reading a very good book by Max Faulkner Cantor about policing in Los Angeles. And it really got to the point of where Watts was like a sea change in the tenor of policing. In which kind of like the police from that moment forward, and there were direct kind of parallels to what happened in Detroit a few years later, where militarization took over kind of the police force. And all around, not only the US, but globally as well, right? And it had impact from not only the rebellions of the 60s, but also the Vietnam War. And we see that, of course, ramifications today later with the war on terror getting enacted on the streets in the forms of policing that we see today. And most of our first 3 sessions, the first dealt with policing in the 60s. The second dealt with stress and policing and efforts to combat kind of police brutality in the 1970s. And then we talked about gang shit in the third session, which dealt with the war on drugs and the Reagan era and kind of like, you know, the carceral state and in its full-blown form. But we wanted to end tonight because I wanted people to be sure that they think about, when I say policing and when I teach about policing, I want to be clear that it's not just the boys in blue and the women in blue that enact policing, that policing is broadly defined as a form of kind of containment, right? And you've heard this before, but it's to establish quote unquote law and order. And as we've learned kind of throughout the course of this is that obviously communities and the police define law and order very, very differently. Right? You know, protests now in many ways, just like they were in the 60s with the Black Panther Party, people were saying, we need the police, you know, we need law and order from our police because they're lawless and they're creating chaos, right? And conversely, of course, the police will make the same claim to try and build up the funds that, you know, support their departments, right? But I wanted us to consider the idea that policing transcends kind of that law and order that we're speaking of, or that police speak of. That order is defined by kind of like the elites in the society, right? And so it's not just elites clamping down on protesters like we see today, or clamping down on crime in the streets and the poor, right? It's not just the actions of the police and imprisoning of people, but policing or containment takes place in various different forms that impact the lives of Black and brown people and poor people. And it's as and equally nefarious, and it's part of the same strategy of containment and order that the elites kind of enact in society. So tonight, we're gonna explore forms of containment and policing beyond the realms of police department that include attacks on access to clean water and affordable water, decent and truly affordable housing, right? Because we're in the midst of both a water crisis, or crises, I should say, and a exponentially terrible housing crisis that's looming, as well as on democracy in the public sphere or the public sector itself, right? So we have some wonderful speakers with us tonight. First up, we're gonna have from Flint, Claire McClinton. And for those of you in my class, you've read about Claire in your book. And I'm going to ask her about this book later. It's Anna Clark's Poison City. And I wanted to get her take on it. But Claire is with the Democracy Defense League. And Claire, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but you were either involved with the League or with the CLP. So if you could let us know which of the two, that'd be great. And she's going to be followed by Joshua Akers, who's Associate Professor of Geography and Urban and Regional Studies. He's also the founder of what's known as the Urban Praxis Workshop. And Josh, when you get on here, if you could, please give them your website. Those of you that are familiar with like Loveland Technologies, who do like mapping, right? And you know, they create maps of places, oddly, like Detroit or like Puerto Rico, or like, if you could find any place that kind of financial institutions want to get their hands on, like Loveland just happens to have like open source maps, and they're surprised when they're utilized by people that want to exploit those populations. And so Josh's work is in direct opposition to that. And he did a really yeoman's work trying to identify the actual owners of property, right? Which is very hard to do in a city like Detroit. There are all these LLCs and the way that people hide what they're actually doing. And after Josh, we're going to have the wonderful Maureen Taylor from Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and the People's Water Board. Maureen, I don't want to say she's like a mother to me because she's not that old. She could be my sister, but I love her like a adopted sister. Let's put it like that. And last but not least, certainly, is the smartest Goldberg on the east side of Detroit, myself included, Jerry Goldberg, who's a wonderful anti-foreclosure attorney. He's with Moratorium Now and Party for Socialism and Liberation. So with that, let's begin, and I'll get out of the way. Claire, are you with us?
Yes, I hope so. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Good.
All right. Would you introduce yourself? Oh,
You are muted.
yes. Would you, okay. You can begin. I'll let you go. You got about 20 minutes really, but please, if you
Oh,
could.
20 minutes. Oh my gosh. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, my name is Claire McClinton, and I had the fortune of having been a part of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers for a short while towards their transformations. I was a part of the Communist Labor Party. I am a Flintstone, and my parents worked at General Motors and all of that. So I'm just really in most respects, just the average resident in Flint or Detroit. All of our stories are familiar. Now, I wasn't really able to, first of all, I want to thank the Institute for inviting me to be a panelist. General Baker was a mentor and a hero to so many of us, and we learned so many things. And I want to open up with something that he has said that we use a lot to guide us and anchor us, and that is that we've only got three fronts of struggle: the legislature, the courts, and the streets. And I want to talk a little bit about the legislative part. And I talk about the emergency manager, because the Black community was used as a rationale for sending emergency managers to predominantly African American cities. And as probably this audience knows, over half of the African American population in Michigan was under the rule and dictatorship, as we call it, of the emergency manager. They used a lot of Black stereotypes and just vile narratives to justify taking emergency managers on. Now, for those, I'm sure that most of your audience know the emergency manager was a individual that was dispatched to cities and municipalities as well as schools to set aside your local democracy. And I just think this is so important, because as we witness the horrendous uprisings of police brutality and fascist assault on predominantly African American protesters, we also had a fascist assault on our cities through the emergency manager. Many people and many scholars, and it's sad that they have not dug into the underpinnings of the emergency manager to see how corporate America, bondholders and hedge funds, seize the assets of our communities. There were three features to the emergency manager assault and offensive. One was predominantly Black communities. The second was high poverty rates. And the third was rich assets. If you had those three characteristics, you were just like low-hanging fruit for a takeover and a dictatorship model that has not been duplicated in this country of dismantling of democracy. So I think this is important, because the origins of this type of playbook, or this model of imposing dictatorship on communities probably began not just with the 2011 law, the Emergency Manager Law, Public Act 4, but some of this was preceded back in as along with that as early as 2001 through Privatization Magazine, the Mackinac Center that we all know as a right-wing think tank. And they published in their magazine, Privatization, back in 2001, a special edition of that magazine outlined the assets of Detroit. And they had the rationale of how turning over public assets to the marketplace would be the answer to saving cities. 10 years later, we got emergency manager laws. And despite the fact that the people overturned that law, originally Public Act 4, they reintroduced it during a lame duck session, and we ended up with that. And the reason why this is important is because the media, we fought so hard. We picketed, we shouted, we took over City Hall and did everything we could when this water was switched in 2014. Finally, the media paid attention and we got a national and international coverage. However, there was a failure to dig into the causes and the roots of this model of dictatorship. And it was really, and still is, a fascist model. And I think we need to pay very close attention to that as far as our threat to democracy. So I think the other thing that I want to share is that why would our state and the corporate interests thereof turn to such a bizarre method of and model to rule over the citizens and residents? And I think we have to understand that we all understand we live in a capitalist society. He who got the capital rules, and that as production is converted into technology, the capitalists and their friends have to turn to other forms of subsistence. And one of those things that they do to try to rectify this technology revolution that pushes them into a impossible situation, because the exploitation of workers is how the money is made. So now that you have robots taking over production, how do you extract surplus value? And one of the things they do to compensate for that is to turn to public assets. And this is what made the emergency manager law so attractive. And so I think when we talk about the police brutality and we talk about the rise of hunger, lack of health care, and all these things, we are talking about a population of people who have been driven out of the productive process. And in the process, the resistance to being in these situations invites a fascist or a brutal response from the powers that be. So I'm just going to leave it right there.
Claire, is it okay if I ask you a question?
Sure.
Have you had a chance to read Anna Clark's book?
I have not read her whole book.
Yeah. What did you think of the part that you did read, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, I thought that Anna Clark's book, the parts that I did read, was very insightful, and I like the fact that she did extensive interviews with community people.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't go wrong when you talk to the those who have been impacted by these things.
Mhm. Could I ask you also, you know, Flint was in the media for a good period of time and then it kind of dropped off. Could you describe the circumstances and situations that residents there face with their water today?
Well, our water situation, it has not changed very much. There was a lawsuit that brought us the replacement of service lines, and we're happy for that. But now we're being insulted by the state, offering a $600 million compensation package,
Mhm.
and it's a slap in the face. And so we're trying to navigate through that. But the quality of life has not improved that much for the residents. And the 120 million or some give and take some change that was dispersed through the federal government that went to the state first, and they in turn dispersed the money, that the community has not felt hardly any impact from that particular so quote unquote compensation. And one of the things that we demanded was that we be declared a disaster area
Mhm.
rather than just being declared an emergency. Because with a disaster area, we would have got service much quicker. Pipes would have been replaced much quicker. They wouldn't have just replaced service lines. They could have replaced our water mains. And we have been demanding that people's internal plumbing be replaced as well, along with healthcare and other things. I won't get into all of what our demands have been, but we have been shortchanged every step of the way. And the Genesee County Medical Society has still cautioned residents not to drink with filters, to continue to use bottled water. The bottled water disbursement was cut off by the state last year. So we still got a lot on our hands on top of the COVID and everything else. And I just think it's interesting how the state manipulates those of us that try to put up some resistance to what's going on. Last spring, we all know they had the big protest down in Lansing with the Proud Boys and the AR-15s and all the rest of it. And those folks who were in their cars honoring social distancing, but they were there to say they want the state to open. But they had this group that peeled off and went into the Capitol with their AR-15s, and we know now that some of them were arrested in the horrendous threat to the governor, kidnapping and so on and so forth. But compare that to what the resistance of the Detroit Will Breathe met with mace, batons, rubber bullets, and the like. And I don't think those folks down in Lansing got a traffic ticket in their protest. So this is how we're being manipulated. This is how we're being controlled. And again, I say it's through legislative, courts, and in the streets. And thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Claire. I'm going to have more questions for you, and hopefully the students will at the end, and whoever's viewing. So if you could stay with us, I'd appreciate it. Claire brought up a very good point, and I should have mentioned this in the beginning, but what we're really looking at in terms of policing, when we think about policing, we think about state violence, right? That's what Claire was talking about with regards to the police and the way that they've been treating Detroit Will Breathe. But like what happened in Flint with emergency management, and what happened in Flint with the water, and going to a source that everybody knew, was going to poison people, the Flint River. This is a form of state violence. And I think it's important for us to understand that by its nature, capitalism is violent, right? And so we're going to segue here because we also have an experience of state violence, but also the violence of capitalism against people just trying to put a roof over their heads and a massive impending housing crisis. So I'm going to bring in Joshua Akers, sorry.
There we go. All right, I've unmuted. Thank you very much. It's really it's a privilege to be able to speak here at GBI and to be on this panel in particular. So as David mentioned, I run the Urban Praxis Workshop, and one of our projects is Property Praxis. You can find both those pieces of work at urbanpraxis.org or propertypraxis.org. We have a really major update coming to the Property Praxis website in about the next 2 months. So you'll be able to look at 5 years of kind of speculative data and ownership and be able to do a lot more with it. So, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a timer because as I've been an academic for too long now, and I understand that when I'm really excited to talk about what David asked me to talk about, which hasn't happened in a while. So I was asked to talk about housing crisis and housing policy as a form of containment and policing of the poor. And I was thinking about this, and there seems to be a sudden awakening, at least in the general consciousness of liberal whites and academics, that the government policies of the past shaped racial inequities in housing and wealth that's omnipresent in the US. The recognition of the role of policy as a racist practice has been accelerated by recent books. There's Rothstein's Color of Law and Trounstein's Segregation by Design. And they bring the impacts of policies such as redlining to the forefront, or at least the front of mind for those interested in cities. There are incredible projects out there that make the practices of the homeowners loan corporations redlining maps increasingly accessible and visible to a broader public. There's the Mapping Inequality Project at the University of Richmond, which has digitized all of these redlining maps and a number of other socioeconomic data. There are also attempts to undo or mitigate the impacts of these policies, local level zoning changes, such as those implemented in Minneapolis last year, and re-emerging approaches to reducing class stratification in housing, rent control movements all over the country. But I'd argue that this contemporary epiphany on redlining and the accompanying municipal movements around zoning do little to solve our housing crisis, which is a manifestation of policies of containment and control through race and class segregation. At this moment, when it appears a functional understanding of the effects of these policies has emerged, it also points us to a historical amnesia, to the agnotology or production of ignorance that white supremacy depends on. As recently as 2000, the historian Arnold Hirsch detailed how in the 30s, Black newspapers across the US saw the plans of the Federal Housing Authority as building ghettos for Blacks in US cities. In 1959, the US Commission on Civil Rights argued that the US government and the Housing and Home Finance Agency were active agents in the containment and isolation of Black Americans in inner cities. The Kerner Commission report in '68 is direct in its dissection of the role of housing policies and de jure and de facto segregation policy and segregation policies, not only dividing cities by race, but also by access to opportunity. And as many have argued, right, segregation is not only a separation from, but also the denial of access to, and I'm going to offer you a bit of a twist on that as we move forward. There's a proliferation of academic work on federal and local housing policies in the 20th century. They constructed ghettos, concentrated poverty, destroyed Black wealth, cultural hubs, and institutions. At its best, it's focused on the ways in which corporations and government work in concert to maintain and adapt these hierarchies and mechanisms of racial capitalism. Cedric Robinson, in his seminal work, Racial Capitalism, Walter Johnson's recent work on St. Louis, in the case of redlining, urban renewal, and mass incarceration, Catherine McKittrick and others detail the historical antecedents of chattel slavery, the plantation, and the practices of domination and deliberate attempts to destroy a Black sense of place, to understand what McKittrick theorizes as plantation futures. I mention these because these are incredible. And if we could stop there, that would be great. But instead, we also have a proliferation of academic work from various disciplines, desperately searching for the long-term impacts of redlining and urban renewal on the land, in buildings, and the territories that were once excluded. It is possible to divine the effects of these programs on the land and buildings that were targeted, but to search here, to try and understand our present condition from these places, fundamentally misunderstands the way in which racist practice operates. These practices target people and communities, which can be disrupted and torn apart through forced movement, surveillance, and policing and incarceration. And these practices target places and spaces that can be dismantled and destroyed. What's mediated through these policies is not the land or its development, but the realities, potentials, and possibilities that exist for racialized and impoverished communities. So where do we look to understand the contemporary housing crisis? There's really no way to describe where we are now but as a crisis. Even prior to the pandemic, the housing question had pushed its way to the fore. Mortgage and tax foreclosures, the consolidation of property ownership, dwindling numbers of low-cost homes, declining numbers of subsidized housing units, increasing rents, rising evictions, and limited shelter capacity. This is the urban environment which many people now operate and try and survive in. It was this way before the pandemic, and it's increasingly difficult now. So I'm going to approach this question in two ways. In the first instance, we can take the long historical arc of federal policies, real estate, and lending practices to understand the physical and immaterial boundaries of containment, the exclusion from. But in the second instance, I want to flip it a bit and talk about the opportunity too. And by this, I mean the opportunity for state and local governments, businesses, lenders, speculators, and predators to extract benefits from these boundaries, what Ruthie Gilmore calls organized abandonment. In the first instance, we have an incredible chain of policies and events to lead us to our current division and separation. Redlining, the GI Bill, federal highways, blockbusting, urban renewal, model cities, the HUD FHA crisis, and the subsequent mass demolitions that followed. By the mid-70s, outmigration and white suburbanization are continuing apace, but the disruptive impacts of global economic restructuring begin to fully emerge and increases the precarity of working class laborers and those increasingly isolated in urban centers that are now transitioning toward finance, insurance, and real estate. These are the mechanisms of organized abandonment. In the second instance, we have increasing consequences of financialization and the perverse ways that it increasingly penetrates and destabilizes the home and our everyday life. The savings and loan collapse, subprime mortgages, mass foreclosures, bulk selling and buying, the rise of algorithmic discrimination, and the continuing withholding of mortgage lending in these areas. These are consequences in the opening of these spaces for exploitation and expropriation. Territories stripped of functional public and private resources through punitive policies, policing, and neglect. In the case of US cities, this violence is what Marion Werner characterizes as fundamentally a class war underwritten by shifting yet remarkably durable politics of race. The consequences of organized abandonment take many forms, from agents of the state, right? And agents of the state, from the police to the prison, or from the judge and bailiff to eviction. Public support and resources decline from transit and schools to the physical housing stock that residents and tenants find themselves shuffling between. But organized abandonment isn't uniform or universal. It's uneven, with localized geographies marked more by the destruction than creation. The impacts of destruction are clear, not only in the landscapes of cities like Detroit, but also in the isolation and continued deprivation and displacement of people within them. Many of these cities have seen revitalization and gentrification projects in long disinvested urban centers. And while these developments have increased displacement pressures in the core, these displacements only add to those on the periphery that have continued unabated. In the context of Detroit, where displacement pressures beyond gentrification are more acute, Alicia Montgomery refers to the current trajectory of Detroit development as utilizing a Zong-ship logic, in which the racialized and other are sacrificed for the concentration of resources for the few. So there's, and just as a way of moving, for those that aren't familiar, the Zong was a merchant ship. It sailed off course in 1871. There were 470 enslaved people aboard. Running low on supplies, the captain ordered the enslaved thrown overboard in order to make an insurance claim. Essentially, the human cargo being deemed disposable so investors could avoid a loss. And this is the way that Montgomery begins to give us a way to think about the relationships and developments within the city. Detroit's now a majority renter city. Over 43% of Detroit residents are rent burdened. They pay more than 30% of their income in rent. Rent burden is on the rise across the country, and as in the case with nearly every economic statistic that burden is disproportionately borne by Black and Latinx families. The mortgage and financial crisis of the last decade wiped out what limited wealth low and middle income families had built in their homes. Many seniors lost their homes and were left to find rental accommodations on fixed incomes or retirement savings depleted by a market collapse or slashed in both corporate and municipal bankruptcies. Again, these impacts were disproportionately borne by Black and Latinx families. So Montgomery gives us a pretty good start with the relational aspect of gentrification and ongoing neighborhood decline. And this is more than downtown versus the neighborhoods or Detroit versus the suburbs. In my work with Eric Seymour on evictions, we found that those living in public housing and subsidized housing are facing the most eviction pressures. This is not surprising, given that limited and fixed income makes maintaining stability really difficult. But the vast majority of our current policies and prescriptions and our attention has looked the other way and instead focused on increasing affordable units, which is a misnomer, or increased concern over subsidized building in gentrified areas moving to market rate. Legitimate concerns, but again, ignoring that these places are primary sites of eviction. We also find high levels of displacement in single family rentals and land contract houses in neighborhoods outside the 7.2 miles of development into Detroit's core. These are particularly pernicious as speculators and predatory landlords are targeting low-income residents and often taking all of their savings or the money they borrowed and scraped while placing them in contracts that are guaranteed to end an eviction and in houses that are unhealthy and unsafe. The eviction machine in Detroit operates like this. Bulk owners buy properties out of tax foreclosure. They prey on low-income residents, evict, and start again until the house is no longer habitable. The landlord then lets it go into tax foreclosure and the public pays to tear it down. In the meantime, tenants are left to bounce from predatory landlord to couch or car to predatory landlord and trying to find a place for their family. The choices are poor and the houses are often poisoning their kids. Our research has found kids are 1.8 times more likely to have lead poisoning living in housing where a landlord has 10 or more properties and buys out of tax foreclosure. Throughout the foreclosure crisis and in the ongoing waves of eviction in Detroit, the default position of the state, in this case the judge, is to accept the legitimacy of the landlord's complaint even when the complaint is without merit or brought through the use of a predatory and questionably legitimate contract. The intersection of state, finance, and property work to continually dispossess the poor from the few assets they've accumulated and their ability to access stable shelter. There's now an entire subsector of the economy organized around displacement and dispossession, advertising suites of eviction services. Dumpsters are delivered to hold the contents of a house. Day laborers are hired to clear it out. The bailiff brings the notice and gives the all clear to enter, and the police maintain order and perimeter when necessary. While bulk landlords exploit their tenants in their neighborhood, the city continues to withhold resources from these same neighborhoods and residents, instead diverting money into heavily subsidized development in the downtown core, pet neighborhood projects, business development schemes, policing, and surveillance. The fundamental lack of respect in this administration for the people it serves has been evident throughout the pandemic, and it's a response to the demands of a broad coalition, including Detroit Will Breathe, to defund the police, end surveillance, and stop evictions. But if we step back and look beyond the city limits, that suburban boundary built through housing policy remains. From limited public transportation to the active policing of these boundaries in entering suburbs like Dearborn and Warren, they catch low-income residents just trying to get to work in a car they can barely afford, in a cycle of debt and incarceration that spirals into narrowing life chances and opportunity. Street democracy and its street outreach court spends many months trying to resolve even the smallest infractions that have mushroomed into thousands of dollars in fines and fees. But even this service, well intended, comes with the requirement of penance, some type of community service or demonstration of self-improvement. This is at the requirement and urging of the court. It's a punitive system that demands subjugation in lieu of payment. It sees poverty as an individual failing rather than structural or systemic. It is also a predatory economy in which policing from Ferguson to Dearborn are used to drive revenues to maintain city budgets. And at the root of these encounters is the ever-present threat of state-sanctioned violence and premature death. Since 1950, Southeast Michigan developers have built 10,000 more units per year than were necessary for the population. George Galster calls the relationship between abandonment and overbuilding of the suburbs the housing disassembly line. But the surplus of suburban housing has not done much to move levels of race and class segregation in this region. This is due in part to the unique powers of zoning and the refusal of vital services such as public transportation. The various building requirements, lot sizes, and mobility options serve to both set a price floor that is a primary determinant of class access to a particular town or suburb. The ban or strict limit on multifamily housing, the refusal of government housing assistance, all play an essential role in maintaining division and boundaries. Right? The arguments for maintaining these restrictions can range from economic choice, property rights to aesthetics. But as David Freund artfully pointed out, this language of property rights and the utilization of zoning came in response to the federal court decisions limiting de jure segregation. It is a powerful rhetoric that continues to drive the defense of suburban development today. In predominantly Black suburbs where many middle-class families moved over the past few decades, if not earlier, legacy costs have begun to challenge municipal budgets as the population ages. State transfers have dwindled and poverty is rising. Places like Inkster, which were intentionally hamstrung by the incorporation of Dearborn Heights, and that thin line that captured the area's commercial strip and revenues, leave difficult choices for residents and municipal officials. Cedric Robinson argues that white wealth and resource control are built through and dependent on the extraction of value from racialized communities. Again, the incorporation of Dearborn Heights is instructive. In 1960, is instructive in 1960, as is the state Supreme Court's decision to dismiss Inkster's claim of racial gerrymandering, arguing that the city had not shown a legally recognized harm. Purefoy and Seamster have built on this idea in their work on Black townships in Texas to argue that Black places are the resources on which white places rely for their own growth through creative extraction. And George Lipsitz frames this another way. He argues that the most important movement to understand of the latter half of the 20th century was a white reactionary response to the civil rights movement. Lipsitz argues that the suburbs should be understood through the lens of hostile privatism. Essentially, the balkanization of power and control at the local level allows suburban residents to be quite liberal in their spending on local public resources and quite regressive and protective at the scale of the state or nation. This process can be seen in Michigan's withholding of hundreds of millions of dollars in tax revenues from majority Black cities. Between 2003 and 2014, the state withheld $732 million from the city of Detroit, nearly the size of the grand bargain, and more than enough to avoid a bankruptcy that extracted control of city assets and amenities. It withheld $54.9 million from Flint, an amount that would have allowed Flint to clear all of its bond debt, eliminate the deficit that led to emergency management, and have $5 million left over. Decisions that in the worst case here were fatal. In conclusion, I just want to say that a house is fixed in place, right? But it's also situated within this tangle of relationships we call property. And that technology of property requires numerous regulatory and legal apparatus to function. As a property, the house is both a commodity, becomes both a commodity and a dwelling. But the value of this commodity is only determined by the levels of public investment in the surrounding area and the infrastructures that tie that place into the urban fabric. In spaces of organized abandonment where the commodity has shed much of its value, the tenant carries the potential profit, and the velocity at which one moves tenants through their properties increases profits in the limited window of habitability before that house can no longer be rented. For those on the margins and marked by a credit report with an eviction, the possibilities of accessing the communities their rents build beyond the city become increasingly dim. Housing policy operates as a means of containment, but it also creates avenues for continued extraction and exploitation. So, thanks.
Thank you, Josh. That was wonderful. If you could, before I move on, could you just speak to the contemporary crisis, the scope of it, what we've got on our doorstep, what people
Sure.
are facing, and what people stand to gain from it?
All right. Sure. I mean, so right now, I mean, it sounds like 36th District Court has been is going to be shut down through the holidays due to the COVID crisis, which means they won't be processing evictions, but they have been processing about a little over 40 evictions a day for the last couple of months. We're waiting to see what wave is coming. So essentially there is a CDC moratorium that ends January 1st or December 31st. That means courts open on January 4th without any real restriction on filing eviction. We've seen rents are in arrears at all levels of property, from your regular market rate rents or rate residential. So it's all on the line. It's all on the line for tenants. The shelter system is operating much like our PPE system, where everything was a just-in-time delivery system. It's already full. It's at capacity. There's not a lot of places for people to go. On the other end, where I study speculators and large-scale buyers, they've been pooling billions of dollars and chatting with each other on message boards about the lessons they learned from the last financial crisis and all of the buildings that they will soon acquire through to the mass foreclosures that they believe are coming. So we're just over a decade on from the last housing crisis, and it appears that we're on track for another complete reordering and consolidation of ownership, an increasingly dire situation particularly for low-income renters.
I'm gonna make sure to ask when we have Q&A about what people could do to help the grassroots work and community organization work that's been going on. There are a number of different organizations. Josh works with several, and I want you all to know, again, when we do these things, we want you not just to learn, but we want you to learn for the sake of doing and to make the world better. Right. So we're going to definitely get to ways in which, people can participate in seeking to combat some of these injustices. With that said, I think Maureen Taylor is now on the line. Maureen, are you with us? Oh, I see you. You look beautiful, by the way.
And thank you so much. All right. Sorry to be a little late. Car situations, emergencies that had to be solved. But I've been able to listen to some of the folks that have already spoken, and a lot of very interesting and valid concepts have been shared so far. And I was thinking as I heard Claire and some of the other folks making comments, from the very beginning, we have been fed a parcel of lies right from the beginning. The message went out: if you come to the new world, there's land and there are animals and there's, whatever else that you think you might want, and you can just have those things. And all you need to commit to do is to just work for those things, and you could become anything you want. Packed full of lies. We are all equal in the new world, all equal. And that one, that's one of my favorite ones because it's being used during the COVID crisis right now. We're all equal, and a derivative of that concept is we're all in this together. We are, and how that comment and that mindset continues to resonate, and people say it all the time. They make placards on the back of your cars and bumper stickers. We're all in this together. And at the end of all of the talking heads on TV, whatever channel you watch, we're all in this together. Yep. And it just goes on and on and on. And I noticed also how good we have become in giving a list of all of the bad things. Boy, we can go through that list, and the housing ain't right, healthcare ain't right, the opportunities for people of color, it ain't right. And we got a long list of the usurpations and the violations that continue day after day, year after year, up to and including watching this wild and crazy presidential election. We're reeling from here's an attack on democracy that's been going on 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 months, and all of the strict constitutionalists that you would think would be out in the street saying, what the hell is this? We have a right to vote. Everybody's supposed to have a right to vote. but the strict constitutionalists apparently have all been struck with laryngitis all at the same time. So they're not making any comments whatsoever about, you know, bad things that are going on, especially in their area of expertise. They're supposed to be able to say, well, the Constitution says this and the Constitution says that. And now we have all these differences. And again, right up until the election, and even in Michigan, we got 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. All they had to do was certify an election. And at first, that they couldn't get that right. It's just over and over and over again. Then I want to just kind of share, these are our thoughts that come to mind when I hear my colleagues talking. How good we are at describing the pain that so many populations are undergoing. I mean, I watched and I listened and I felt what it looked like to have little children separated from their parents. And I swore, if this happens, I'm gonna pack up my stuff, I'm going down to the border, and I'm gonna get in this fight, because I know a little something about being taken away from your parents and sold off. So I knew something about that. And I looked and I waited, and there are, you know, a lot of organizations, individuals, a whole movement that went there and argued that point and are still arguing that point today. And where I end up now, and I'm going to make a presentation about these water shutoffs, I want to quote the great rural historian, and that would be Wile E. Coyote. And Wile E. Coyote spent a lot of time, a lot of years, chasing that doggone varmint, as he would call him. And then I remember the first time I heard somebody say that it ain't that much fun when the rabbits got the gun. And I remembered that, and how did that fit into the situation? So, you know, Detroit Will Breathe, ain't that much fun when Detroit Will Breathe got the gun. Welfare Rights is out here fighting and demanding that the access to water is a human right. And we raise those things. And again, the answer to that is it ain't that much fun when Welfare Rights got the gun. Now it's an issue. Carolyn and Marion and Valerie over here, and Ann and Dr. Dave and a whole bunch of other folks get involved. Oh, the phones are all ringing. Get involved in opening up the General Baker Institute. And, you know, here we got DTE issues and water issues. Yep. And ain't that much fun when Carolyn got the gun. And that's the way this stuff continues. And I want to say to my colleagues, you know, at some point, we have to stop being the reactionary group, and we might as well start some kind of a fight on our own. If it's not clear today that this capitalism just does not work, it just does not work. If it's not clear, then I guess we're going to have another day, another week, another year, another decade, another century trying to catch up with what righteousness looks like, what righteousness sounds like. 2014, Welfare Rights started to receive a lot of telephone calls. We're generally getting 2 to 3 telephone calls per hour where people were saying, I'm having some trouble with a light bill, a gas bill, and water bill. And suddenly in February of 2014, we started to get 5, 6, 7, it went up to 10, 12, 15 telephone calls every hour where people were saying the water department is on their porch, or the mail person just delivered a shut-off notice, and there was pandemonium because it happened so quickly. And after a little bit of investigation, again, this is February 2014, what we discovered was that the water department in the city of Detroit had embarked on a new practice where if you were $150 behind or 3 months behind in a water bill, that was enough to have your water disconnected. And I know that at that time, and we were straight on this, and the reason I have these figures and I know these dates is because of myself and Sylvia and Marion and Gwen and Ann. Some of us were some of the early folks in 2014 and others that started to take a look at what the heck was going on. I got a opportunity to meet with a City of Detroit employee, a clandestine lunch, and went up to the appointment and found out that there was a list already of 59,990. That's 59, comma 990 addresses, separate addresses were on a list slated for water shutoffs. And I thought it was a typo. And when I questioned this individual, well, where'd you get this from? I work for the city of Detroit and I'm in the administration and I know what I'm talking about. And I made you a copy of this list. And it was so demonic that immediately we start calling, all welfare rights people got alerted, start calling around to other organizations, People's Water Board, anybody and everybody we could find to talk about what the hell is this going on. And right around 2 or 3 months later, we get a call from Claire and some of the folks up in Flint. There's something going on in Flint. Well, what? We ride up to Flint. What's going on there? And found out that General Motors had already sent an email to the governor and his staff explaining that General Motors was not going to be using Flint water anymore because after 2 to 3 months, Flint water, the new water, was starting to corrode the metal parts in their cars. So they had decided that they were going to shift over and go back to private water until they were able to connect Detroit water again. And oh, by the way, Mr. Governor, you might want to let the residents of Flint know maybe they shouldn't drink the water. Oh, here we go again. And of course, nothing happened and people were drinking the water. And, I remember one time we went up to Flint and passing out bottled water because nobody knew what to do. It was so horrible. And that was the first time that I had ever heard knocking on doors and going back down the steps after I knock on the door and the homeowner in Flint come to the door. And I'm here to bring you some water. I got a case. I got 2 cases, 5 cases, whatever it was. But I can't come in your house. Well, why not? I can't come in your house because I see you have a very large doggy bowl on your porch. And how many times I heard this message that the dogs drank the water. And we didn't know that the water was poison. So there are no pets in Flint. And it took me a while to realize what I was being told. So the gerbils and the cats and the parakeets and the birds and the dogs and all this kind of stuff that drank the water, they died. And that's just part of the repertoire of evils that happen to working people. And again, I want to stress this point. From 2014 up until today, we are still struggling to try to convince people that water is a human right. We're still demanding that people accept access to water and sanitation as a normal way of treating each other. And when I say that, it sounds like empty words, sounds like it doesn't make any sense when I use that phrase, a human right. If you survive the birthing process, and you live through it, that makes you a human being. And there are certain foundational rights that you ought to have access to. And none of that life, liberty, pursuit of happiness that them slave owners was talking about. That's pretty good stuff too. But I'm talking about you have a right to eat. You have a right to have water and clean sanitation. You have a right to not live on the streets. You have a right to not be shot down by the police or your neighbors. You have a right for peace. You have a right to live until you're in your bed at 130 years of age and you die of old age. That ought to be the expectation for everybody. And it doesn't seem that we've gotten there yet. And it can't get there until we realize it ain't that much fun when the rabbits got the gun. Some kind of way we have to be more aggressive, more involved with humanity, and more involved with creating the rules and demanding that there are certain things that just need to happen. Now, we look through a lot of things and measure and critique things through the racial lens. And we should do that because that's been the United States of America's greatest sidekick. Well, that's the one they love the most when they bring that race question out. Oh boy. And there's always a way to separate and divide and figure out how this group needs to be treated and that group needs to be treated. And this whole conversation about we're all in this together, that doesn't generally show up when the race card is played, right? So now what we have is when you're walking down the street, and I know I'm talking to very brilliant people, but I'm going to be quite simple because I want everybody to understand what I'm talking about here. When we walk down the street, and it's a group of us, and we're walking, and we hear a great big old commotion in this apartment building. And we say, okay, we're going to stop here and see what the hell is going on. And we walk up those steps, and we go to, we get in the building, and in the apartment to the left, it's a lot of noise and a lot of talking and loud screaming and whatnot. We knock on that door and demand to go in. And we get into that apartment, and there are people in there complaining. I get treated this way because I'm an African American, and I'm outraged about it, and I shouldn't be treated that way. And I'm tired of this racism and all of these things. And we listen to all of those things and all of these Black people that are in apartment number 101. And we say to them, you know, you're right, but I still hear there's other commotion going on. So why don't you come on and walk with us, and we're going to fight for the kind of freedom you think you need. So we bring them out of that apartment. Then we go down the hall to see where this next argument is, and we hear a bunch of noise. We knock on the door, demand to go in there. And there are Asian Americans in there. We get mistreated because we're Asian Americans, and we're sick of this. And we get that list, figured out what's wrong. Why are they so upset? Yep, you're right. Come on and go with us, because we keep hearing more commotion. And we go down the hall, and the next apartment has gay people in there. Oh, we get mistreated because we're gay, and we live a different sexual orientation, and we listen to all of that. Yep, you're right. You come on, go with us. And we keep going down the hall. We keep going down the hall as we're going to every apartment and knocking on the door and demanding entrance. And there's a group of people in every apartment down this long ass hallway that are complaining about how they are mistreated. Now we got everybody in the group, men and women, gays and straight, Blacks and whites, Hispanic, Middle Easterner, everybody's in the group. It's a bunch of us. And there's still some kind of noise going on. And now we're almost at the back door, and we look, and what do we see? The capitalists are sunbathing, and they out in the yard, and they've got the kind of wine that I would die for. And they got shrimp and lobster and something on the barbie, and they looking good and living good. And we're looking at each other, well, what the hell is this? And we go out on the porch, and they say, wait just a minute, what you doing? And they tell us, shut up. You didn't pay your rent, so go back in your apartment before we put you out. And we step back in that hallway, and it's all of us, and it ain't but 10 of them. But we are so worried and so afraid, we go back in the hallway of the apartment building, not recognizing that we have seen the enemy and we know what to do. So I'm going to finish my remarks. Hopefully, you will remember the analogy of the apartment building where all of these different groups were arguing because they were not free. And when we get to the backyard and the swimming pool is working and the jacuzzi is working and these capitalists are out there having shrimp on the barbie, all we have to do is go to the porch, the front porch, and gather everybody that's in them damn apartment buildings, keep walking. And when we get to the back goddamn door, One of these days, we're going to open the door. We're going to tell them, look, Mother Scrutcher, you got 5 minutes to tell the Lord, here I come, in whatever religion you want. And then on that day, we ain't got to worry about the folks that live in the different apartments anymore, because now we can take over the house. My name is Maureen Taylor. I serve as state chairperson of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization. We got to stop analyzing and take up the side of the rabbit who is about to get the gun. Thank you for your attention. I'll go back on mute.
Maureen, thank you very much. I got some comments suggesting that I needed to correct one thing you said. Ain't no fun if Carolyn got the gun. Well, hell, Carolyn's had a gun. Ain't no fun if Carolyn got a crossbow.
You know what?
So
It works for
Beware.
me. I hear you. All right.
and I do want to give a shout out to John Q. I missed that good coffee, John. I'm glad you're watching. And I do want to make one thing apparent before we keep going, because I want to tie what you said with what Josh was talking about before. And there's an explicit connection between the fight for water rights, human rights, and housing rights, right? And later, Maureen, if you can, when we do Q&A, will you talk a little bit about the initial water struggle you were involved in Highland Park and how kind of utility bills got tacked on to housing property taxes?
Yes, I will.
All right, thank you very
Okay.
much. Without further ado, I'm going to move quickly, although I'm going to add a clumsy segue here to Jerry Goldberg. But before I do, I just want to point out the kind of like making of the emergency manager. We were kind of talking about this as things were going on. I just want to suggest to you that, you know, things don't just come out of the blue. That in New York, you know, in the 70s, the city was on the verge of bankruptcy. And they used that as a means to install kind of like a financial review board, right? That basically took over the function of the city because of its financial situation. And a lot of bankers were involved in this in particular, and they're attempting to restructure the government. They got rid of a lot of public services. This is what we today as academics refer to as like austerity or neoliberalism, right? But what they couldn't do really is they couldn't really attack pension benefits, and they couldn't go as far as they wanted to, right? So this became an experiment on the right. And in many ways, Detroit marked the culmination, and Michigan marked the culmination of kind of what they were getting at, because they realized they had a problem, right? That if you had local officials and they were still kind of like nominally in charge, right? They wouldn't pursue the same things that the banks were interested in because they were interested in getting reelected. And ultimately, what they came to after various attempted efforts that weren't successful was kind of this notion of emergency management and the kind of like expanded version of it, where it's not just relating to a financial emergency, but what was basically seen as an entire governance emergency, which then gave an outsider the capacity to come in and dictate a whole bunch of kind of regulations beyond the initial vision of it. And it was at this point that pensions and things of that nature could become open up, because somebody like Kevin Orr could come in, doesn't worry about reelection. He works with these banks. He had worked with them as a member of Jones Day. And then he's able to open up pensions. And that now spawns a kind of cottage industry, right? In terms of trying to bankrupt Puerto Rico afterwards. And everybody from here was farmed out to there. I just want to comment on what Josh was saying about, you know, how eviction becomes its own cottage industry. Like TPX in my neighborhood was making hella money boarding up windows and doors following evictions, right? And so, and a lot of people got houses. There was a group called Metro Properties, and I really one day really want to see the full write-up of this. They were given 1,000 houses by the county and never did shit with anything except put some beige paint on them. They milked some of them, let them all go. And to my knowledge, I don't think anybody that was associated with that company was ever kind of brought up on charges, right? Just pilfering, not only the county, but renters, right? So I just want to show you the interconnections with these things, and they're all related to kind of like the broader process that is referred to as financialization, right? So without further ado, I want to bring you to my Jerry Goldberg, the better of the two Goldbergs. And I will say this, I oftentimes have my class read Jerry's interrogation and questioning of Kevin Orr during Detroit's bankruptcy. And if you have not seen this yet, this is a brilliant piece of lawyering. It's available on PDF. Please check it out because it will illuminate some of the things that everybody's been talking about so far. So Jerry, if you're with us, you're on.
Okay, thank you very much. And David gave a good segue into what I'm going to be talking about. Let me just begin by saying I came to Detroit in 1970. I was an SDS at U of M when SDS was a revolutionary organization, and it was kind of fun to be on campus for a while. But we came to organize in Detroit where the workers were, and Detroit was the greatest city in the country in the 70s. It was a city where the Black liberation movement merged with the workers' movement, primarily because of the existence of the League of Revolutionary Black Workers and great leaders like General Baker. And it was a dynamic city. And the capitalists recognized that. So what did they do? In the late 70s and throughout the 80s, when they began the reindustrialization, the restructuring of auto, they shut down virtually every auto assembly plant in the city of Detroit, kept the plants in the suburbs open, shut the plants in Detroit, and they did it deliberately to destroy the power of the Black workers in Detroit. And it had a devastating effect on our city. But despite, even after that attack, by the year 2000, Detroit had sort of stabilized. And now if you drive around Detroit, it's unbelievable what you look at. You see fields and devastated homes and boarded up homes everywhere. But that's not how Detroit looked in the year 2000. Detroit still was a city of neighborhoods. The housing stock was basically intact. It had the highest Black homeownership rate of any city in the United States. It was a city of homeowners. But what happened? In the mid-2000s, the banks came up with a new scheme to maximize profits. I think they'd maxed out on credit cards. So they developed a new scheme, and it was called the subprime mortgage crisis. And what they did is they trained brokers to go into cities, and they targeted particularly Black communities to do it. No question about it. It was a racist attack. And they targeted brokers to go into a neighborhood, and they'd go up to a senior citizen who had their house paid off and say, hey, you need a new roof? No problem. We'll just refinance your home. We'll give you the money for your roof and a few extra dollars. And they put that person in a loan, and the loan would be a decent payment for the first year, but it would be an adjustable rate loan. So by the third year, oftentimes they were paying more on their mortgage than their entire income. And the banks knew that these loans would fail. They were fraudulent, they were criminal, they were deliberate. And the reason they did it is when they bundled these loans together, they sold them on Wall Street as security instruments, as bond instruments, and the rate of profit on the subprime mortgages was 8 times greater than it was on the fixed rate mortgages. So it was irresistible. Sometimes people ask, who were the decent banks during this period? My answer was there were no decent banks. Every single bank was a culprit to this mortgage debacle, this subprime war that they launched on poor people, and especially on Black homeowners. And the effect of it is that from 2005 to 2010, 65,000 Detroiters had their homes foreclosed on by the banks. There were 65,000 mortgage foreclosures. A quarter of Detroit's population was driven out of the city between 2005 and 2010. And of course, when you drive a quarter of the population out, you take the homes of a quarter of the population, it's going to have a financial impact on the city. It creates a financial crisis for the city government. And the answer, and what the governor did, and it didn't just happen in Detroit, it happened in Flint, it happened in Benton Harbor, because it was the Black communities that were the targets of this housing crisis perpetrated by the banks. So what happened was it became a way to usurp the power of Black workers, of Black people, to take over their cities, and it was a racist denial of self-determination. And there was tremendous opposition to emergency management, which was the form that they take. As David said, they would place an emergency manager to take over the functioning of city government, and it was denial of the most basic right to self-determination, especially to voting rights, to the right of people to elect their own government. But on top of that, when it happened, though, our organization had been very active in fighting the banks during the housing crisis. We looked at the bill, and the first thing we noticed in the emergency manager bill is that the emergency manager had the power to rewrite virtually every city contract but he had to make sure that they paid full value on the debt service to the banks. And what did this tell us? This was a Wall Street bill. It was a bank bill. The emergency manager was put in power to protect the banks at the expense of the people. And as David said, that's what austerity does all over the globe. They did it in Puerto Rico, where there's a financial oversight board. They did it in Greece, where they set up a financial board to take over the country during an economic emergency. It's really a form, in my sense, it's like it's direct control by Wall Street and the banks over a country. It's like fascism without the fascists, because they're taking over and usurping any kind of democracy. And that's what emergency manager was. When we got the loans, and what we did immediately is we FOIA'd and we got a hold of all the debt instruments of the city, because we knew that that's what it was all about. And what we found was what had happened in the city of Detroit is the city of Detroit itself had been subject to predatory loans by the very same banks that perpetrated the mortgage foreclosure in the city. In the 2000s, to make sure it had funds to pay the pensions of the workers, they took out what we call pension obligation certificates. And these also were adjustable rate bonds. And so what the banks did, this UBS and Bank of America, they went up to say, look, here's what we'll do. This is an adjustable rate bond. We'll pay the adjustable rate, which means it fluctuates according to whatever the interest rate is at the time. You pay us a fixed interest rate of 5%, and whoever comes out ahead pays the difference to the other party. And they built into these interest rate swaps what they call termination events, where they can call in that difference over a 30-year period. Well, what happened? In 2005, when that happened, the interest rates were about 4.5% to 5%, and the swap rate was about 4.5% to the fixed rate was 4.5%, 5.5%, and the interest rate, the adjustable rate, was about the same. So really, the banks made money off the fees, but it didn't have much effect. But by 2008, as part of the bailout to the banks, interest rates were reduced to 0. So what happened was suddenly the adjustable rate was 0.5% on these swaps. The city's paying the banks 5%, and they get to pocket the difference. So that on top of paying off its debt, the city was paying an extra $50 million a year in penalties to the same banks that had destroyed the city through foreclosures. At one point, the rating agencies decided to declare Detroit's interest rating agency. These are the same rating agencies who rated the mortgage bonds as AAA, as great bonds, when they knew they were fraudulent agencies, got paid by the banks. They declared a termination fee event, and the city suddenly had to take all the casino tax dollars to pay off a termination event to pay off the banks. So all the casino tax dollars that were supposed to be saving this city weren't going to the city treasury. They were going to US Bank to pay off the other banks. And this is what happened. It was a fraudulent deal. The city financial crisis was perpetrated by fraudulent activity by the same banks who destroyed the city and created the financial emergency. And that's really what capitalism, how it works. And there are other factors as well, as Josh mentioned. At the same time, the state cut revenue sharing, robbed revenue sharing from the cities, and that was another big factor. But all these factors led to this state of emergency and the putting in of Kevin Orr over the city. But what happened was there was a caveat to emergency management. And as David said, in Michigan, the public pensions are guaranteed by the Michigan Constitution. And because of that constitutional guarantee on public pensions, the emergency manager couldn't go after the pensions just on his own. And so what they came up with a new scheme, and they decided to use the bankruptcy as a way to go after the pensions of the city workers. And they did that on the basis that bankruptcy is federal and the constitutional court, the constitutional guarantees are state. So they went into federal court, and the most important ruling of the whole bankruptcy was the first ruling in the bankruptcy, where Judge Rhodes, who's a big stooge for the banks, and proved himself over and over again. And as David has recently been in Puerto Rico to advise the banks there how to steal the people of Puerto Rico's wealth. His first ruling was that the constitutional guarantee on pensions was not in effect during the bankruptcy. In other words, they weren't bound by it. They could go after the pensions. And that really became what the bankruptcy was all about. Well, the bankruptcy, ostensibly, they talked about all this big debt. In fact, what the bankruptcy was a way to steal the pensions of the workers. And almost all of the debt relief that occurred during the bankruptcy came by robbing the pensions of the city workers. The effect of the bankruptcy ended up being that, let me find a statistic. Out of the $7.1 billion that was allegedly saved during the bankruptcy, 78% of it came off the backs of the city workers' pensions. It came by virtually eliminating the health care for city workers, retirees, that saved $4.3 billion. It came by cutting the pensions of all the workers by 4.5% and eliminating their cost of living. So about $5.8 billion of the $7.1 billion that supposedly was saved to get the city out of the emergency really came by robbing the pensions of the city workers who built our city, who lived in the city, who served the population. And that's really what the bankruptcy ended up being. It ended up being a big power grab against the workers. During the course of the bankruptcy, there obviously was a lot of struggle because people didn't just sit back and take this. I intervened in the bankruptcy on behalf of some of the retirees. I did it for free, and I don't know anything about bankruptcy, but we did it to intervene, to say that we believe that what needed to happen, not to take the work of the pensions of the workers, but what emergency manager, what needed to happen was we needed to cancel the debt. That the debt of the city of Detroit was a debt based on fraud, as I explained. It was created by the same banks who fraudulently stole the homes of the people in Detroit, created the financial emergency, and then put the city itself into a financial crisis through these interest rate swaps. And it's hard to explain an interest rate swap in a minute, but there's a good movie on it, The Big Short. I advise people to watch it. It's with Brad Pitt and some nice Hollywood movie, but actually it's a pretty good movie in explaining what interest rate swaps and the kind of criminal products these banks can concoct to rob people. So anyway, we intervened in the bankruptcy. We actually put the banks on trial. We had a trial on the interest rate swaps, as David mentioned. I had the chance. And during that trial, we exposed the fact that really the beneficiaries of this bankruptcy were the same banks that had been destroying the city. And in bankruptcy, you can actually eliminate debt that's based on fraud. And we demanded that the entire debt to the banks, to Bank of America, the UBS, was a debt based on fraud. It was based on a fraud perpetrated against the people and now perpetrated against the city. And we actually were able to get the termination event on these reduced somewhat. Rhodes had to do it under the pressure that we put, but the movement wasn't quite strong enough to carry it out. Let me say just a couple other things. And I want to say a little bit about water because that became a big factor in the bankruptcy also. One thing I do want to mention on the housing crisis I neglected to say is what did the federal government do when the banks perpetrated this massive housing crisis on the Black community? Let's be clear, this was the greatest elimination of Black wealth in the history of the US. 53% of Black wealth was eliminated from 2005 to 2010 because most Black wealth was concentrated in people's homes. The gap between white wealth and Black wealth increased to 19 times. The white wealth was 19 times greater than from 7 times to 19 times in that 5-year period. It was a robbery of Black wealth. And what did the federal government do? Well, as we know, they bailed out the banks. And I want to be clear about how this bailout perpetrated, because while the bailout was passed in September of 2008 under the Bush administration, it was in fact carried out by Biden. So when Biden talks about his economic plans, I have trouble celebrating Biden's election because I saw what Biden's economic plan was. It was to bail out the banks. And what the primary thing they did is, in terms of housing, is they took over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were quasi agencies to guarantee mortgage loans, were nationalized by the federal government. So when they foreclosed on a home, the banks were paid full value on that loan, and it was the federal government that was evicting people during that crisis. So I just want to put that in because I think it's important to realize what kind of economic plan we're probably facing in the next few years under Biden. Let me end by saying a little bit on water, because water is the bankruptcy that led to the massive water shutoffs that happen today. And the water shutoffs were also based on bonds. What happened was the water system had taken out $1.1 billion in infrastructure bonds in 2011, 2012. 537 million of that 1.1 billion was to pay off interest rate swaps, the same kind of crooked deals to every major bank, Chase, Merrill Lynch, all of them. And what happened was during the bankruptcy, what they engineered was the Great Lakes Water Authority took over the Detroit water and sewage debt, but it did it on the caveat that it wanted to ensure that it would only do it if it was ensured it would be paid, and they ordered the water shutoffs. And the mass water shutoffs that began during the bank. We actually had a trial during the bankruptcy on the right to water. We went in for an injunction to demand that there be an injunction on the mass water shutoffs, 25,000 a year that were starting then. And you know what the judge ruled during that trial? He ruled that he had to agree there were no plans in effect. There still are no plans in effect that would ameliorate the effect of a water shutoff on an individual that caused irreparable harm. But he said the irreparable harm to the bondholders, if they didn't get paid, was greater than the harm to an individual for not having water. To me, that says everything about capitalism. As Maureen said, this system is no good. We believe Detroit needs to be rebuilt. We need to fight to stop the evictions that are coming, but we need to rebuild our city. And these same banks that destroyed our city owe us reparations for what they did. They owe us billions of dollars, and that money needs to be put in the hands of the working people of this city and the community. So we rebuild our city as a city where everyone has the right to housing, water, utilities. We shouldn't have to say these things to fight, and it means fighting the system, not fighting for a piece of the pie, but to take over that pie and put it at the use of the people. Thanks.
Wonderful, Jerry. I'm going to add a few things, and then what I'm going to do is throw this out. I'm going to post some questions to probably individuals because I want to ask each of you something in particular. But so we were talking about emergency management. I think it's important to understand that there's a direct link between kind of like the setting up of EMs towards particularly Detroit's bankruptcy and kind of like capital disciplining workers and the poor. And what I mean by disciplining them is extracting from them. So when we see, like you mentioned, Josh, earlier, the Kerner Commission, and I had a chance to talk to Fred Harris, who was a senator from Oklahoma, who's on that commission. And I kind of lambasted the commission, even though its recommendations were never taken upon by Johnson. I said, the one terrible mistake you all made was pushing private-public partnerships, right? Because that was their solution for housing. And I bring that up because it kind of gets kind of like referenced in Keonga Taylor's most recent book where she talks about predatory inclusion. And so when we see these things and they're pitched to us about public and private partnerships, we say, oh, isn't that great? The public and the private are working together. Well, no, what that means is the public, i.e. the taxpayers, are subsidizing capital, right? So Dan Gilbert, who has a wealth of over $40 billion, right, in a public-private partnership, pays almost nothing to build a building and then gets to capture those taxes in response, right? And this is facilitated in part by the state, which becomes an intermediary in this. And their job becomes to kind of facilitate the expansion of the wealthy getting even wealthier, right? So we see this kind of like through the machinations of the emergency manager, but we also see it in the connection between Detroit and Flint. And I want to kind of like use this as a bridge to ask Claire a few questions. But the first is that I always felt, and I don't think anybody's written this up in a way that's effective, is that the bankruptcy of Detroit was contingent upon what happened to Flint, meaning that they needed to switch to Flint Water to have what was known as the KWA, a public-private partnership, get its bond deal. And then once that was cleaved off from the Detroit Water and Sewage, right, then all of a sudden Kevin Orr comes in, water and sewage was separate from the city, But as an outsider, he decided to put that into the deal. It didn't have to be part of the deal. Same with the DIA. Oh, we saved the DIA. Well, the DIA never should have been part of that deal. But Kevin Orr made it part of that deal, right? So what happened in Flint, how people's lives were taken and their futures were taken, was in many ways kind of a relationship between EMs to set up a greater vision of long-term debt to make the case for bankruptcy in Detroit. Meaning people in Flint, particularly Black and poor people in Flint, were used as pawns in this scenario, right? So Claire, if you could just talk about the KWA, and I have a particular question about this. Part of the deal with Flint Water and the KWA is that they wanted expanded capacity, right, for these pipes beyond the capacity they had before when Flint was a city double the size. And the question remained always to me was, why did they want these high gauge pipes and this high number of raw water intake in Flint? And does anyone know who that water is serving and where it's going now, or where it will go when KWA is fully functioning?
Well, thank you for your question. Well, the KWA, we are certain, we haven't pursued it, that a lot of those pipes, which don't forget, it's a parallel pipe to the pipe we were using before, but it's a much larger capacity and it's raw water. And we are being told that the raw water allowed for fracking in some of those out counties where the pipeline runs through. There's been a lot of discussion about the Detroit and Flint and the KWA and all this kind of stuff. But one thing we know for sure, the KWA is under the bond debt of JP Morgan, Stifel, and Wells Fargo. And since that deal was signed, the city of Flint has not missed a payment to these bondholders. And I think that was very important what Jerry pointed out, that the emergency manager law allowed the emergency manager to dismiss all kinds of debts and payments and fire people and bus unions and all this kind of stuff, but they were not allowed to forgive a bond debt. So that's a very important point. But there has not been a missed payment since the ink got dry on that debt. In the meanwhile, Flint pays the highest water rates in the country. And many of our residents has been suffered under these shutoffs and things like that, even though our water is not potable at this point, but you still need water for sanitation purposes and things like that. So yes, that's a very important thing to know. We have got to let the public know about these bond deals, because we cannot move forward unless we understand who our enemy is and under whose hegemony we are suffering these exorbitant rates. The major portion of our water bills goes to these bondholders.
Let me just jump in here to reiterate Claire's point and Jerry's. In each of these instances, right, in terms of the KWA bond deal, which is a sweetheart deal too, Kwame Kilpatrick's swaps deal, the Detroit water bond deal, all of these were awarded the bond buyers award of the year in each instance, right? They were celebrated for their creativity and imagination, damn well knowing that these financial instruments were going to bankrupt people and cause harm and death to people's lives. Okay, let me go on. I'm going to ask a question. Let me look who it was that asked this. This is to Josh. If you could talk about Detroit eviction defense and kind of the work that you've been doing and that organization's been doing.
Yeah, you were asking bigger questions about where people could get involved or what they could do. So at least with the groups that I'm working with, if you are interested in both rapid response and long-term kind of tenant organizing in the face of the evictions that are coming, Detroit Will Breathe has a number of members and participants that have been working on this issue, particularly for rapid response. Detroit Renter City is another that's been working around organizing. And then Detroit Eviction Defense is the third one. That's the group I'm most familiar with. Spent a lot of time sharing different kind of data and maps and working on different campaigns with them. Detroit Eviction Defense Mutual Aid Organization. It basically works on a case-by-case basis. So if someone is facing eviction and brings their case to the group works with that person to figure out what it is that what they can do and help them kind of organize and stand up for their rights. In some cases, it's just making sure that they get to housing advocacy and support that they need. In other cases, it is court support, and in other cases, it's actual eviction defenses. It really depends on the case and the person and how far they want to go. I think one of the things that I find most interesting and fascinating about their technique is the way that they use the courts, and that's the idea that justice doesn't come through the courts, but you can buy time in the courts, right, to continue to organize. Because oftentimes people facing eviction wait until the last minute, or particularly when it's something like mortgage foreclosure. There's a lot of social guilt that we build into debt. And it takes a while sometimes for people to figure out that they're not alone. This is a system and a structure that they're caught in, that they're actually out there that want to support. So yeah, I would say that, at this stage,
That gets gummed up.
there is an effective rapid response developing. And then there's also a lot of movement around tenant organizing, and I think in the end, an organizing component is going to be the most important, because it's well beyond the number of evictions coming are well beyond the capacity of all the groups that have been working on housing to intervene in and handle. So I'll leave it there.
I'm sorry, I'm terrible with the muting and unmuting. I apologize for any disruption. We were talking about kind of like a particular situation, and that is kind of like the situation where we went from live hearings to Zoom. So could you explain what the shutdown that the governor is talking about for a 3-week period does to these cases?
Jerry might have a better idea. My understanding is that Judge McConaughey is shutting down the court during this time, but Jerry's unmuted. He might have a better idea.
I mean, basically, the federal moratorium that was put in effect by the CDC allowed the landlords to move forward with pursuing evictions, court cases. They just couldn't carry out the evictions by and large. They still did some, but they couldn't carry out most of them. So what it means, and it also didn't do anything to relieve people of rent. So there are some programs in place, limited programs, but they're, and obviously people should take advantage of them. But overall, the problem is by the end of this year, and so someone mentioned to me that the shutting down the evictions for 3 weeks at least doesn't allow the landlords to pursue getting writs on people during that time. The big problem we're going to have, though, is that after December 31st, there's really no effective protection in place for tenants. And we're going to face a tsunami of evictions, and it's going to be everywhere. And I think, and really, it's going to take a huge movement, as Josh said. Whatever groups are involved, we're all going to be out there, and hopefully people come out. And people shouldn't underestimate. During the foreclosure crisis, we also used the technique of going to court, and we'd fight the case as long as we could. And then when we lost in court, we'd pick at the bank, and we'd have a home takeover. We move some people back in with Maureen. first of all, it's a lot of fun to do that. If you win a lot of times, you know, it's an it's hard to win a victory when you're an activist, but also it's confrontational. And also, you know, we need, at the same time we do it, we need to expose these landlords. A lot of the landlords locally are investors, as Josh said. Nationally, what's happening is in areas where the housing market is bigger, the same kind of Wall Street securitization of mortgages is now occurring with residential housing. I look to them bailing out the investors. That's what I anticipate happening, that the federal government will probably step in to bail out the landlords and the residential investors and landlords, just like they did with the banks. But we need to expose this stuff. And sometimes by just exposing the investor and putting the pressure on and combining with action, you'd be surprised the power we had. We won a lot of cases that way, a lot more in the streets. So I would encourage people, get involved. I mean, it's a righteous struggle. It's fun somewhat. It is, actually, especially for younger people. And we can win. We can score. Don't think we can't score victories. And when the movement's big enough, we can score massive victories. In the 30s in Michigan, when there was a huge movement of unemployed councils, we had a 5-year ban on any foreclosures. There was one. It was one because of the struggle. And if people get organized enough, we can score a lot of victories, but it really requires people being out there and also to put the focus on the source. And sometimes activists feel we can't tell the whole story about capitalism or the banks, but I disagree. I think people know what's going on. They're anxious to hear the source of the exploitation. And also in places like Detroit, most people have been screwed by the banks on a personal level anyway, so they understand what's going on.
Dave, I just have one more thing. I mean, with everything that Jerry said there, but building on what Maureen was talking about taking action, I think one of the tenant organizations that I think is the most inspiring in the last few months is KC Tenants in Kansas City. So they've shut down. They've basically figured out ways to shut down Zoom hearings. They've chained the doors of the courthouse shut. They've managed to bring a number of federal lawsuits with the ACLU against specific judges that have been doing evictions in different pieces. It's both an incredible organizing outreach and effort that they've been doing, but then their ability to also take action and shut down these pieces has been really really inspiring and offers some, I think, some potential pathways forward.
I have a question that I'm hoping will elicit responses from several of you. This is from Ann Rail. And she mentions that she's wondering if any of you see any connections between public housing programs or the dearth thereof and the dispossession and exploitation of homeowners and renters. And Maureen, specifically, if I could get you to speak on this in terms of kind of the takeover movement in the 80s and late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. You know, the Kensington Welfare Rights and certainly groups out of New York. I'm thinking specifically about Roy Casanova and some of those folks that were absolutely relentless in terms of taking over housing. Certainly, Welfare Rights had our share of that activity. I still remember chasing, what was that guy's name? I can't remember. He was the head of housing in Detroit, and we were chasing him through the projects, running. That's when we had good knees. And we were running, trying to find this guy. We saw him enter a particular a housing unit, I believe in Brewster. And he was running to get away, and we were running to catch him. And so we had some very direct experience in that. And a lot of lessons were learned, for sure. The Homeless Union, Wayne and Dee Dee, and some of those folks that we were all working with, the Union of the Homeless, certainly Welfare Rights, and another, a series of other organizations, activist organizations. And for years, we actively moved people into public housing, especially when we figured out, and I'm talking specifically in Michigan, we found out that all of the public housing units had stoves and refrigerators already in them, and the electricity and the heat was already on. So as we entered into public housing at Brewster Douglas and at, I've forgotten what the name was of that group over there on I-75 and Parkside and all the rest of them. We had friends and whatnot and organizational structures in every public housing development. And almost all of that was organized by one of my favorite people. She's gone now, Ruth Williams. Boy, that Ruth was just, Lord. Ruth organized these homeless, these housing locations. And it was clear after we understood what was available and we were paying for all of these housing developments anyway. And probably one of the biggest lessons that we learned was that, we're talking Wayne and Dee Dee were on the east side over at Parkside with the sledgehammer. They were over there with another good friend who's gone now, Tyrone Chapman from the Michigan Veterans Foundation. And he put a bunch of soldiers and Nate Thomas and 30, 40 soldiers and a whole bunch of other folks over on the east side at Parkside with a sledgehammer in the dark. And opening, he take that sledgehammer and open those doors. And the police were all over there on the east side at Parkside trying to catch up with our troops that were over there opening up apartments. And where we were was on the west side. We were quietly opening up apartments with Thomas Rudolph and his brother Danny and some other folks. So while the Malcolm X ploy caused a disruption over here, while the real action is going on someplace else. So hundreds and hundreds of people we were able to move into public housing. And one of the biggest lessons that we learned was people will leave an apartment that we took over for them because they didn't have toilet paper. And it was just simple things like that that we were not aware of at the time. So the connection has to deal with how hard we try to correct this list of wrongs. We have the opportunity to move people into vacant housing, and the state fights us on it. And you have to ask the question, why? We have the capacity I remember we had gardens in some of the public housing units that we were able to develop with the 4 C's from Michigan State. And we had manure that we brought in from the Detroit Zoo and went to some of those plots of green grass in these different public spaces where there were what they call projects. And we planted food that would grow in 1 year. And the city came and bulldozed all of those gardens because they said we didn't have permission to feed poor people. These kind of things that just keep on happening. And our response for the most part is to try to fight that, as opposed to taking a superior position that says we have every right to live decently. So are there connections between what happens in the active takeovers? Absolutely. Are there connections to the loss of housing? HUD has gotten out of it. Yes. There are connections to all of these things, but we don't seem to learn quick enough. We've got experience. We have expertise. Jerome Goldberg talked about it. But we can't learn fast enough and move in the direction toward positive movement on a regular basis. I'll go back on mute and see if their other thoughts.
Let me intervene because I want to get a couple questions in here now. But like, we have a bunch of people that are asking about proposal N, which dummies should have meant no, but apparently it got voted yes. But also recently there may have been good news, right? We've heard about Mayor Duggan talking about over 7 years, 800 new quote unquote affordable housing units in the Southwest, ironically in an area that's prime for gentrification. With the advent of Ford in the
Right.
former train station. So if we could just deal with kind of what Maureen was alluding to, and I guess what the question before was talking about, public housing was its own kind of racket and trap for Black people. But as a result of kind of the shift towards privatized housing, right, you had extreme exploitation of renters and, deteriorating housing as well. And so now there's a lot of talk about creating a place where people that have lived here for a number of generations can continue to live in the city. What do you make of these more recent phenomenon, and where does this leave kind of the majority of Black Detroit?
Dave, can I start with a quick discussion about that very thing? Okay, folks that live in public housing and those that were for sure the activists, Miss Grace Byers is in a private home right now, but Ruth and Miss Johnson and some of these folks that I grew up with and mentors of mine certainly trained me. They love public housing. They did not have anything bad to say about it because living in public housing meant that you were protected. If your income went away, you could not be evicted. The Brewster Douglass homes, for those that knew anything about them, they were, and for decades, they were beautiful. Brick houses that all of the newer facades and buildings and structures around them in terms of individual homes, the first good wind came along, they were gone. Lost electricity, just like we did Sunday and Monday of this past week. So living in Brewster Douglass, living in some of these different, certainly high rise, but the low rise public housing units, I know of all of the residents and most of the residents that we work with, they would not leave public housing because there was a degree of protection there. This is a new phenomenon where on TV and every place else, people say, listen, renting is, we're turning into a renter's paradise. And it used to be that the city of Detroit was one of the largest areas where single homes were owned by African Americans, and that stayed the case for a long time. But I can tell you right now, I live in a house. If there was an opportunity to let this mother scrutcher go and go someplace where I could live in pay 1/3 of my income to live someplace, and my water and my lights and my gas were included in my rent, I would be going to that tonight. You wouldn't have to wait for me to move in the daytime. Right. But I wanted to just say that this panacea that people put together, don't you want to own your own house? Yeah, that's how we get to this definition of private and public partnership. Somebody said it was a good idea, and so we run over there. Somebody said to own a house is a good idea, so we run over there. But those folks that I grew up with, including Ruth, including Ms. Byers, and all the rest of these folks, they would not leave public housing unless they left it feet first. And it was for economic reasons, even though many attempts over at the Jeffries were employed to make it difficult for folks to live there. So I just wanted to straighten out a little bit of that history. I'll go back on mute.
Can I say a couple words to what you said, David? Just most of the city council bills that I've seen define, when they talk about building affordable housing, define affordable housing based on a metro standard, a Metro Detroit standard, where it takes the median income for Warren, Livernois, and Detroit. So what it becomes then is affordable housing. You're entitled to affordable if your income is $60,000 or less. Well, the median income for people in Detroit is $30,000. So the fact is, it's really a way many Detroiters are excluded from this definition of affordable housing in these new places that are being built. Secondly, you got to suspect when they're building affordable housing in an area they want to gentrify, the banks are obligated under the Community Reinvestment Act to invest a certain amount of money in distressed communities. But what studies have shown is the beneficiaries of that investment have been gentrifiers. Because what the banks do is they go to a community that's already been destroyed, they build new housing, and the people moving into it are the people who are gentrifying those areas. So it's another way to subsidize gentrification. Proposal N, just to say 2 words, was a boondoggle for the bondholders. It was a junk bond. The interest rate on the bond was $227 million. So it wasn't a $250 million bond. We're paying $477 million on that bond. And what does it do? It puts the onus on repairing blight on us. We didn't cause the blight. The banks caused the blight. They should be paying to repair the blight, not the people of Detroit who've been the victims of that blight and whose tax dollars, whose property taxes were stolen based on illegal assessments. So this bond, it's a shame that there wasn't more of a struggle that could have been used. And I think during COVID, it made it more difficult to really expose, to use that bond vote as a way to really do an expose on the whole housing situation in Detroit. But it was nothing but another boondoggle by Duggan on behalf of his developers.
Josh, you got anything about that, especially the Southwest?
Yeah, no, it's, they're gonna tear down the complex right behind where I live, as part of that proposal, rebuild, reconnect it to the street grid. There's nice things that could be done to reconnect it to the neighborhood. It's fenced, it's bermed, it's Clement Kern. But they're gonna tear down the whole place and reconnect it to the street grid. It falls in line with another question that was earlier, which is, and what we know from earlier versions of Hope 6 under HUD in the 1990s, and also in the Canadian experience. I spent a lot of time in Toronto, and they've done a lot of this mixed income experimentation as well. And what we find is that actually, we don't do a full replacement of the affordable or even the subsidized units that were there before. The majority of tenants that are promised the ability to come back don't return, right? It's the amount of time that it takes to build it, the opportunities of where they're at. And what you see is broader kind of neighborhood change, right? So areas that are already in the midst of gentrifying and development, as Jerry pointed out, continue that trajectory. Over the last 20 years, Detroit has lost 20 units per 100 people that qualify for subsidized housing. Yeah. So what we had in 2000 to what we have today is quite extreme. And then, I'm stuck on the mixed income thing. I'm thinking of the Poor Doors in New York City and all of these other kinds of pieces that have been built into these. This Detroit proposal with HUD does have some potential. It's quite a large grant. It actually gets some things down to 20% medium AMI, which gets us into some pretty good territory. But it's a very limited number of units at that rate. And lastly, what I'd say on proposal N is that it was based on a large number of faulty assumptions. The idea that there's an ability to renovate these houses, that there's a market for it, that there's even people that can pick up the kind of income or other kinds of means necessary to redo them. But even though it's a very marginal amount of money on behalf of the city for these homes, there's not really some place for these to go, or people for these to go to, unless they just end up with investors or larger kind of nonprofits or public-private partnerships. So yeah, it's really unfortunate that it passed. I kind of did what I could to try and submarine it, but I obviously can see how little influence I have.
Well, let me on that note, we're almost at the end, but I wanted to give all of you a shot to kind of plug some of the things that you're doing, some of the areas in which people can help out. So we'll go in order. If I may, Claire, AKA Squeaky, could you talk about what you're doing? Is that and different organizations that could use some public support?
Well, what we're doing now is we're trying to navigate through this so-called water settlement, the $600 million compensation package. So we're tied up with that, and we're trying to get the voices of the people heard in that about that. We're also organizing while this COVID shutdown is in effect, but we're gathering our resources to put a referendum on the ballot for water affordability. And but I just want to end up by saying that it is important for us to understand the big picture of who benefits from any of these initiatives, who benefits. Because if you don't know who benefits, you don't know who the enemy is, then you end up choosing between your health, COVID, or your job. And what kind of society is it that make you choose between your life and your job? And so we have to really constantly try to up the ante on understanding for the people to understand that they are locked into a system that is no longer beneficial to our common humanity. We often talk about in Flint that the people that came here before the media got a hold to this water crisis, Maureen mentioned she had come down here, people from all over the country, when they got word about it, they came here to help. They brought water, they brought hugs, they brought pennies and nickels and dollars. And we need to create a society that's a reflection of that kind of humanity.
Claire, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Maureen, if you wouldn't mind plugging whatever you got and just talking about the ways in which people can uplift this very timely work that you all are doing.
Okay, well, the only reason to fight for Trump to be evicted was so this Mussolini lookalike guy, who is just the absolute representative of the ugliest kind of capitalist voice, he needed to go. And he needed to go because the American working class said he just too much. He's got to get the hell up out of here. So since that was the concept of folks, certainly welfare rights wanted to get in lockstep with that kind of a concept. It wasn't so much that anybody was in favor of the Democratic candidates. It's just that we knew that this kind of poison needed to go and needed to be exposed. But the other part of this is that the American working class is convinced that the Democratic Party is the party of the workers. So, okay, all right, we're going to test that theory. So now we got this no good son of a gun out. We got 4 years. We got a 4-year plan in place. So between this presidential election and November of 2024, we're going to get everything we think we need. So I have been, and we have been through welfare rights. We contacted 5 or 6 homeless organizations, a couple of them in Chicago, Joe Perry and some of those folks. And we're asking them to start setting up communication networks so that all the different homeless organizations can have conversations together across the nation and come up with what it is that they're going to do. Having those same kind of conversations with Al and Al Koger and some of those folks that are working on universal health care, and putting together all the folks across the country, especially through the welfare rights contact pieces, put all of them on the phone together. And the folks that are working on universal health care in Detroit, those that are working on it in New York, those that are working on it in Durango and Chicago and LA, put them all on the same line. And they're all starting to have that conversation. So we're looking at communication networks for housing, communication networks for healthcare, communication. Matter of fact, it's a meeting tomorrow. Teachers are getting together in Wayne County to talk about what is the best way to educate these kids under a pandemic. And it's teachers from Detroit, teachers from Highland Park, instructional staff from New York, some from Chicago, starting these joint conversations across the nation to figure out what we need to do. But the concept at the end of the day is, after we try to help organize these light conversations, then we want to talk about how can we get an advisory board, a national advisory board that looks like a third party, and to pull these voices together from the Atlantic to the Pacific and have everybody. This is the advisory board. And what we're going to do is to explain to others, here's what we've got to have, here's when we need it, and we will tell you, Kamala, we will tell you, Joseph, and the rest of these folks, here's the things that we've got to have. So those are the activities that we are involved in, a 4-year plan. And anybody and everybody that has some ideas, we welcome your thoughts. I'll go back on mute.
All right, I'm gonna read these off because Joshua and Jerome posted these, and I'm gonna kind of curtail our discussion for a minute. DetroitRenterCity.com is a group on the east side of Charlevoix that's working on kind of evictions and organizing kind of people in their homes, whether they're homeowners or renters. But the emphasis there is on Detroit. Traditionally was a city known for homeowners and single family homes or double family homes in the form of flats, right? In fact, I think Ann mentioned this before. We had more kind of units, single family houses than any other city in the country. And now we've transitioned really as a consequence of the mortgage crisis and the subprime mortgage lending. We've become a renter dominated city. Also DetroitEvictionDefense.org. It's an organization that Joshua works with and other people as well. And they've been fighting very hard to keep people who are the victims of these subprime loans in their houses, as well as Detroit Will Breathe. We will have hopefully in the spring semester more from some of the members of Detroit Will Breathe who will be with us. And Jerry mentioned also moratorium -mi.org, and then the PSLweb.org, which is the Party for Socialism and Liberation. So if you Google that, or hashtag PSL Detroit for Facebook. And I want to end, well, let me go to Josh real quick and then I'll close up.
I just have one specific need. If anybody's out there that has front-end web development skills, we are building a real-time eviction tracker. We've almost got all of the back end done. This will help with organizing. It operates very similar to Property Praxis. So Organize will be able to grab it. We'll link between buildings that are owned by the same people, and you'll be able to see all that in relatively real time. So if there is anybody out there with those cool skills and wants to jump in and help us, please send me an email.
Can I make one concluding remark, Dave?
Please.
Yeah, just real quick. I just want to add to what everyone else was saying, that I think getting involved with any group that's fighting evictions, from Detroit Eviction to all the groups that have been listed, we're all in it together, and we're all fighting to survive. And I think getting involved, and there's a lot to be said. And it's so the work's critical. And I think it's really going to be the critical struggle in the next period, of course, along with the water struggle that's always there and getting involved. But I also want to echo what Claire said, that, this Detroit that used to be was a Detroit where revolutionary ideology was strong. We were the one city, we had a mayor who ran for mayor, Coleman Young, running ads of him defying the House Un-American, House American, whatever they call it, UAC. We had even our politicians came out of the socialist and communist movement. And I would encourage people, look at the broader picture, because I think Detroit, we're at the stage now where, everything we're fighting for is a little piece, when capitalism is so outdated and so outmoded and so destructive that we got to think about a new system. And I think now is the time to study that, understand it, look at it. The various groups, General Baker Institute has tremendous study groups consistently, and just find your way to just not only the day-to-day struggle, but to look at the broader his picture of what capitalism is about. And I believe very strongly that things don't have to be this way, that the time is overripe for a society where human needs and supersede profit as the motor force. And that system ain't capitalism, it's socialism.
All right, I want to thank everybody for coming tonight and for your contributions. They were wonderful. I'll reiterate what was said. For those of you watching, just know that whatever repressive world you grew up in, it doesn't have to be like this. It wasn't always like this, and we could do better, right? And we have to. Quite frankly, our survival depends on it. So, wherever you're coming from, seek out a means to kind of contribute. That would be my one thing is like, it's one thing to learn things and sit on them, but, take what you've learned and commit to doing something, whether the issue is housing, whether it's economics, right? The inherent kind of flaws in the capitalist system in the way that it kind of impacts people's lives. And in the case of Flint, kills people or, literally retards their progress from living a full adult life, right? Commit yourself to making the world better. Right? And a better world is possible. And I thank you all for attending the series. And I look forward to seeing you all in the fall and hopefully having you guys back again to speak to us. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.